Hello and welcome to Communicating and Supporting as an R2. My name is John Heldman, and it's my pleasure and honor to be your facilitator in this virtual session. So that you know exactly what the presentation will be about today, the focus is on the R2 and some of the techniques that we can proactively or reactively use. But I do think that much of this is applicable if you're an R1 working alone as well too. And we're going to look at three different themes. Presentation will be organized in three pieces, and that is working with the scoring table, working with your partner as an R2, and then a little bit of bench communication and interaction. I'll use actual scenarios that have happened to me or that I've garnered from colleagues. And at the end of each theme, I'll offer a few other tangible takeaways in regards to your interactions with that particular person or group of people. So a little bit about myself to give you some background about who you're hearing from today. I'll start down in the bottom left corner. Those are my two wonderful, beautiful children. Natalie there is airborne. She loves to dance. And Nathan is smiling because he's always smiling. One of the happiest go lucky kids I know. So they are why I do what I do. When I was a kid, I grew up in O'Fallon, Illinois, right outside of St. Louis. Uh, Navigated up northward to central Illinois for my undergraduate work at Illinois State, go Redbirds, and I majored in math and secondary education. And then I am now in the Chicago suburb area where I live in Bolingbrook and have taught for 20 years at Downers Grove North High School. 14 of those years, most recently, has also been as mathematics department chair, and I lead a group of 20 teachers in that regard. I coached for 6 years when I started at DGN. I took a year off after becoming department chair and then had to get back into the game. I missed it too much, so I got my officiating license with the IHSA. I don't coach or officiate any other levels, so my perspective is purely through the IHSA lens. And I also want to clarify that I'm not looking to be seen as the all-knowing expert on the topic of communication and work as an R2. I hope to be able to facilitate some thinking and push your thinking in different ways, and maybe build upon the work that you've already done, or if you're just becoming involved as an R2 based on the levels that you're working. Hopefully this will provide you some intricacies into the challenge that it is to be an R2. It seems easy at first, but the more you get into it, the more you realize that there's so much to it. Lastly, I'll just offer to consider having a three takeaways mindset over the course of this presentation. That being, are there three things that you can think about differently or try to implement within your practices as an R2? And if you can identify those, then we've had a successful session, and it was a good use of your time. So last bit of housekeeping items here before we get into the actual content of the presentation. Just want to share that the information that is being provided in this presentation is based off of solid practice that occurs in the game of volleyball and the art of officiating volleyball in its current state. It's very possible, perhaps even likely, that the way we interact with table personnel or our partners or bench will be different by necessity due to the challenges that we are living through currently with the COVID-19 crisis. So just a disclaimer that this is good information, but it may need to be adjusted, and we'll all be in that together as we try to move forward. Also, in terms of logistics, I am going to invite on several occasions you to pause the video after a scenario has been presented on screen and get some reflection time. I'm going to build in probably 3 to 5 seconds of pause, but obviously, assuming most people would need more, pausing the video as each scenario is presented will allow you to reflect before I, as the presenter, share my philosophy or interpretation. Okay, so let's start with some R2 interactions with the table communication. Again, um, we'll invite you to pause the video if you'd like a reflective opportunity before hearing or seeing comments from the presenter. So this situation is allowable. It's not desirable, but it's allowable. We can use a player from another level, team manager, even someone else from the stands, technically. But when we're going to do that, what we don't want to is to have the libero tracker being the scorekeeper. So the timer and libero tracker can be jointly combined, and then not from a blame lens, but it's always a good idea to just let your assigner know that so that they can keep track of what's occurring at the levels. And I know a lot of the lower level matches, to be able to have two people at the table is a blessing. So just keep people informed and know that we don't have to forfeit the match in this regard. Okay, second scenario, and again, I'll pause and invite you to do the same with the video. So I'm not sure if this has happened to you, but earlier in my career it did. And a couple things that I think are important to understand here. If you're in the match, we can't completely suspend play. It's not fair to the athletes that have warmed up and are in the match. But try to keep it simple, but give some feedback as you go. A few things that I have tried to use in the moment in terms of phrasing would be if there's a scoring issue about the running score or the individual score, remind them it's always player point, team point. Okay. When it comes to side outs, a lot of times they forget to dash the side out in that regard. So I use the phrase dash and burn on side outs. When we have substitutes, there's three different places that you have to record that substitute. So be ready to explain to the scorekeeper where those three places are, and always, be sure to check that, which really, can be easier said than done, but during timeouts is a good opportunity. I think the biggest takeaway for me would be the notion of avoiding unproductive questions. So in education, in the scenario, does anyone have any questions, is unproductive. It doesn't invite active participation if they do have questions, and it allows the individual to say no and be okay and feel safe about the fact that they might have questions but don't want to surface them. So thinking about asking things like, what's a scenario that you recently encountered that was difficult for you, or having some scenarios in your back pocket. You can say like, well, what would happen if the libero, did this, or if you saw three people come in as substitutes, what would you do on the score sheet? So just a variety of things that have either happened to you or could potentially happen is a nice way to just explore whether or not prior to the match getting started, we're ready to actually rock and roll with the match. So here's our third table scenario. Again, invite you to pause and reflect before continuing the video. So the assumption here is that now we've started to use some of those more direct or productive questions. And it's been, proactively, we now know before the match even starts that they don't have that knowledge that they need. This is where the requirement of coming at least 30 minutes earlier to a match is really critical. And take the time to teach to the extent that you're able in regards to the other responsibilities. A lot of times people are recruited that don't want to do this job or don't understand the complexities of the job. And we have an opportunity to share our passion and enthusiasm of the sport in this situation. So tell them it's going to be okay. Tell them you're going to work with them. Teach them a few of the basics without trying to go through everything in 5 minutes necessarily, would be my suggestion. And then we're going to have to adjust our thinking to either as an R2 or as an R1 working by ourselves. And that's just the reality of the situation. We're here for the kids and we need to support our team of workers. So thinking about some additional checks of the score, of subs coming down off the stand as an R1 if you're working alone on that first time out to see how things are going, and then adjusting pace as needed will definitely help new scorekeepers, libero trackers, timers in this situation. So we've come to our last scenario with our table interactions. It's been quite a week in terms of what we've experienced, and I'll invite you to pause the video and consider this last scenario and then share some thinking. So I think the key here is that we have to address this more than anything. It's a disservice to our colleagues when we allow this to happen, because when someone else walks in the next day and addresses it, I don't know how many times have you heard, well, I've never been told I can't do that before, right? So the idea here is that we make it about the kids and that their job is important. So on the screen is a statement that I use in these types of situations. And I frame it with, listen, I noticed that you were on your cell phone. I know that we all have a lot of things going on in life, but the kids deserve our full focus, and we're all part of this team. And you're just as important as I am, and I'm not on my cell phone. So just trying to get them to understand that it's not okay for a mistake due to an external distraction like a phone to occur. We're going to make mistakes, but when it's because we were on a cell phone and now the score's messed up and we didn't discover it, until it was too late, um, it's problematic. So be direct with people and address this behavior, please. I would also offer that if you are kind and direct in trying to address it, but they continue the behavior, that this is something that you should share with the AD. And if the AD doesn't see it as a problem or understand the importance of it, then certainly I would offer that you inform your assigner of the experiences that you had in that regard. So just to summarize a few tidbits with table interactions, when you get there, start with a smile. Thank your workers in advance. Even if you were there 2 days ago, at some point before that match begins, as early as possible, thank them in advance for the fact that they're part of the team. Let them know you're here to resolve issues. One of the best phrases that I have found with working with tables is, I'd rather we stop for a non-issue than not stop and have something wrong. I've committed that to memory. I use it all the time, even if it's with a table I'm comfortable with. I'd rather we pause and learn there's not an issue than keep going and you tried to hide something or you were afraid that you were going to get in trouble for it. So keep that in mind. I would definitely encourage that philosophy. And then lastly, it goes back to that ownership piece. The more they feel a sense of ownership, the better. I think this goes equally for brand new scorekeepers who are going to be motivated and empowered by getting positive feedback, as well as that 20-year veteran that's set in their ways. They know everything they want to do, how they want to do it. Let them have that ownership as long as they're not incorrectly doing their duty. I try to let scorekeepers and trackers check my lineup cards, give them the ownership that they're the ones that have the right information, make sure that I, in fact, do as well. Calling out subs, do they want to do that? Do they want me to do that? Somebody should verbalize it, in my opinion, but let them make that decision and try to adjust accordingly. And then, during timeouts, you got to check and make sure people are doing their duties, and then acknowledge and celebrate when they are with just a genuine thank you. So hopefully that's some information in terms of scenarios and tidbits that will help with table interactions. Again, this might all have to be adjusted temporarily or permanently, But even if it does, the theory behind it hopefully is something that will encourage your reflective capacity. All right, let's dive into a little bit of partner communication conversation. So this is something that kind of relates to partner communication, but it's just a little tidbit that I would invite you to consider, and that is, how do you carry your cards during a match? First of all, you got to make sure that you have them in your pocket. I've been in situations where someone is, wanted to card and needed to card a player or a coach, but then forgot they didn't have the cards in their pockets. So a lot of people will keep both of them in the same pocket. I know there's several people that put red in the right and yellow in the left. Why is this even important, really? Well, because it comes down to professionalism. And when we get to a point where we have to sanction with a card, um, we need to look professional and confident in that. We're not going to, fling the card in somebody's face, but we need to come out with a card crisply, come out with the correct card as part of the sanctioning process. So I bring this up just as something to consider because you want to make sure that you're ready to go when the situation arises for you. So for me, just to share my strategy, I carry 3 cards. I have the red in my right front pocket, but I put a yellow in both of my back pockets, left and right. I do that because the red in right, uh, the alliteration of that, it just has worked for my brain. We're more likely to pull out the yellow before a red, and knowing that I can reach into either back pocket, whether I need to provide an unnecessary delay sanction or it's a sanction directly to a player or a coach, either way, I can grab that card, not be worried about what color it's going to be. The mechanic that I need to use for the unnecessary delay is natural and smooth if I pull it out of the opposite pocket, whereas if I'm providing a traditional yellow card sanction, I can just pull it out of that same side. Anyway, moral of the story here is consideration of how this applies to the concept of looking crisp and professional and confident in all of your calls, but particularly when we get to a situation where a sanction is warranted. All right, so here's our first partner communication scenario. Again, please feel free to pause the video to be able to read and reflect, and then in a couple seconds, I'm going to begin with my discussion. So this is something that I've actually been on both ends with as an R1 and an R2. And I think what it boils down to me is, did we as officials do our due diligence in both of us individually or as a team, ensuring that we gave the coach the opportunity to call the timeout? As an R1, with my partner, thinking about it as the R2, did he or she scan both benches, provide enough time, or was there pace in between the end of the last point and beginning to beckon for serve for the next point too fast? Because we can get caught in that and not realize that the coach needed more time or was trying to call the timeout and we didn't even look at it. As an R2, definitely this is where scanning comes in as well too. And then I think it's also important that, as you get closer and closer to the end of a set, or even when a team starts to go on a serving run, as officials, we need to be a little bit more conscious that these might be times where the coach is going to call a timeout. So I think this is where my perspective as a former coach is helpful, because we need to get a feel for when are the common times that a coach might call a timeout. We do, however, need to make sure that this wasn't a delay tactic. So if my partner is already motioning me over to come across and confer, what I would do is I would be checking with him or her about whether either of us felt like we did not scan or were too quick with our pacing, or even if one of us felt like they were waiting until the beckon was going to begin to try to get that timeout and potentially be a delay tactic. If we didn't feel that those things were happening, then I would advocate to my partner to allow the timeout. I want to try to do that quickly, because by me going over to my partner and responding to his or her request to discuss, we're already giving a bit of an informal timeout in the first place. So just processing it through those lenses and making sure that we give the benefit of the doubt if possible. Okay, our second scenario in this category. So ultimately, it is your responsibility as an R2 to serve and protect, right? We have to not overstep our bounds, but we also want to make sure that the call is right. So a couple of strategy ideas here. As you go over to discuss with the head coach, who is clearly upset by the call, you can remind them that they can send their captain over to the R1 to receive an explanation and then come back and share that explanation. That allows them to get the info straight from the person who ultimately made the call and is responsible for the decision. And it also allows just a little bit of time to potentially maybe calm things down as well too. There have been a few occasions in a situation like this where I have, as the R2, gone back to a visual connection with my partner and used a hand motion to try to ask them if they'd be willing to allow me to come over. I try not to do that very much. And if I'm going to do that, I'm going to make sure that I feel definitively that this is a potential misapplication of a rule or misunderstanding of a rule as opposed to a judgment call. Okay, so if this is something where it was a illegal back row attack, back row block, situations where there's interpretation about the contact of the ball or the height of the ball or a body part, I'm not going to step in and I'm going to tell the coach, Coach, my partner had the perspective that they did and that's what they saw. We need to move on with this. If it's a potential misapplication of a rule as opposed to a judgment call, I may, in a few circumstances, ask to come over, particularly if the coach has been respectful and specific in their concern about the interpretation. But in general, we can use the captain to be the go-between on that, and then we debrief afterwards and get the perspectives of both parties. Our third and final scenario, again, if we want to pause the video, there are a number of different potential subparts to this, and then we'll conclude this section. So again, in trying to stay applicable to real life, all of these things are things that have either happened to me as an R2 or things that I've been told as an R1 by my partner. The key question here is how and when. I think if any of these things are significant concerns or issues for you as an R2 in regards to you feeling like you can effectively do your job, then they are certainly something that you can address in the pre-match. I wouldn't go overboard with how many of them, but for example, the net fouls before you have a chance to finish your mechanics as an R2. I've tried to find a way again to just let my R1 partner know, hey, I'm going to be here for you. I'm going to go through my mechanic and thanks for letting me finish before you actually award the point. So just something like that can be done in the pre-conference, but it can also definitely and should be done in the debrief. And again, here's where you want to invite them to consider your perspective. If I've learned anything in education with working with both teenagers as well as adults, is that you don't want to tell them what they should think. It's not going to work for 4 out of 5 people. Invite them to consider your perspective and your reality of the situation and how that might be adjusted in their practice, or maybe what they saw, and follow your constructive criticism up with a, Did you see that the same way as I did, or did that feel the same to you? And I think if that happens, then we all are in it as a team, and we're inviting each other to be reflective as opposed to pushing a change onto someone. So a few tidbits in regards to partner communication here. You, you got to speak through your signaling, but you've got to talk about this in pre-match. Things like potential for hits, back row attack. What does your partner want as the R1? What do they not want? Stay active during the play. Once it's dead, if I could offer any piece of advice, it would be to do that transitioning to the offending side as much as possible. Particularly if you can't transition, center back physically and visually with your partner so that they can gather information. You can understand what it is they might need from you. Follow the signal pacing of your partner. Don't lead or mirror. This is interesting because leading, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. You're coming out as the R2 before the R1. I'm offering to not mirror either. This again is where you might get a different perspective from a different colleague, but when we are exactly in tune with our R1 partner, we are potentially anticipating what they're going to put up. And if we're a half second behind and mimicking, then when I think it's a touch, but my R1 puts out an out, even if I think it's the wrong signal because my brain has already processed that this should be a touch call, I give my partner the opportunity to lead and be in control of the signaling and the match. And then I can record that point in my head and go back and say like, hey, remember 6 points in the second set when you gave that out? I was ready to come up with a touch. Can we talk about the right mechanic there? I think that's huge and goes a long way. So mimic, don't lead or mirror, and then blow the whistle when it's your call. The things that I have listed there as an R2 are your call. Your antenna, outside the antenna, net fault, center line, those are your call. An R1 that wants to be a team player is going to wait for your whistle, and if they don't get it, it's going to cause problems. So be ready to blow that whistle and be firm with your call. So the third and final theme is about bench communication. We're going to present 3 different scenarios as well as some concluding tidbits. Instead of having a reflective prompt to go with each scenario, I've got some choices of actions that could occur, and they'll come up at the same time that the scenario does. So again, once the slide comes up, please invite you to pause, reflect on which of those choices you might select in each scenario and why, and then start the video back up in regards to some explanations from my perspective. So here's our first scenario with the bench and some possible actions that could be taken. Feel free to pause and reflect. So in this situation, it may seem mundane, but there's a couple of things that could be at play here. The first is the notion of players moving towards the court opens up the possibility of missing a libero exchange. A player, if players are sitting at the front of the bench closest to the R2, they could even potentially be moving close to or into the substitution zone when they do this. And so the perspective that I have here is that this is not something you want to allow to have happen. The other thing that's at play here is that it does open up either the perceived notion by the other team or in actuality the potential for poor sportsmanship. If they're coming up and out and even turning towards the center of the court, the net, the other side of the court, that's inappropriate. One of the things that we should always be talking about in the pre-match with the captains and coaches is let's do all our celebration directed towards back to your side of the court. So nothing towards the other team. And again, it just opens up the opportunity that they could be taking advantage of this. So I use the phrase up but not out. And not just that, but like up and towards your players. Keep it on your side, keep it up, but don't come out. Those types of phrases can be useful and I would do that through the head coach. I know I at times have done that with players, but we expect the captain or the head coach to be the communicators to us. So it's probably best practice for us to reciprocate um, to the head coach our expectations in this regard. Okay, here's our second scenario regarding bench. I'm not sure about the gym setups and where you work, but I have this happen a lot. There are a lot of places that I work where the bench is on the side where spectators are not allowed to sit, or if they are allowed to sit, there's quite a lot of room in between the bench and where the spectator bleachers are. Um, I think the key for me is the positive cheers and encouragement. And you could extrapolate this with like a freshman A to freshman B group as well too. These are lower level matches, and if they're showing positive cheers and encouragement, uh, I personally tend to let this go. But I have on occasion been proactive by again talking to the coach and saying, um, I see your varsity girls there, and I'm hearing a lot of positive cheers towards your team. I just want to make sure you know that if I start to hear unsporting cheers or negative cheers towards the other team, they're going to be removed. And, be direct about that if need be. Or if you even come into the gym and you notice that there's a potential for that, you could, in theory, be proactive, prior to the match. But the fact that the upperclassmen are cheering on the underclassmen and it's remaining positive, and both benches have the opportunity to allow that to happen as long as they're not coming onto the bench or towards the court. This is a scenario where I feel that promoting positive sportsmanship is acceptable. Again, alternate perspectives exist, and it's all about reflection and considering what your tolerance is in this regard. Our last scenario, again, invite you to pause briefly. So I have been challenged by this assumption, and it's one of those things I have to remind myself to reconsider. As a former coach, I never had the opportunity to stand prior to that rule being implemented. So I didn't understand it until I worked with a couple officials that were former coaches or current coaches even. And either of these behaviors, whether standing close to the sideline or standing back behind the end line, geometrically gives the potential advantage of different lines of sight, and coaching and gathering scouting report, for lack of a better term, in that regard. So it is, I would argue that it is not appropriate to allow a head coach to do either one of those things, even if it's not affecting your field of vision and technique as an R2. So I definitely would not recommend sanctioning right away. This is another one of those cases where I'm going to come up to the head coach and I'm going to say, Coach, you're standing too close to the sideline during play, or Coach, I've noticed that you're drifting back behind the end line. Both of those potentially provide an advantage with angles during the play. And so I'm going to need you to stay between the 10-foot line and the end line, or I'm going to need you to come back closer to your bench. It's not one of those things I'm going to argue with them. If they want to make a fuss about it and they continue to do it, I might give a second reminder. I might give a card. But the notion that this is allowable is not okay, and something that I myself have been focused on as a primary goal and will continue to do so, because there are advantages based on standing at those angles. Not to mention that it could potentially affect you as the R2 if they're too close to the sideline. So we've reached the conclusion of the final theme of the presentation. A couple takeaways, perhaps, is the importance of scanning. Don't just do it to do it. Actually look for things that need to be addressed in that regard, and then go back to your partner. And if they're beckoning for serve before you're done with your scan, that's something that you would debrief upon at the end of the match. Set your expectations early. I can tell you from experience that it is you can't be a passive observer of the match as an R2, but you don't want to over engage as well too. So just address what needs to be addressed, and do it early when it happens so that the expectation is clear. When coaches engage, give them the opportunity to be heard out. If they're engaging inappropriately, give them direct feedback to that fact, so that they understand the expectation. Do that beyond or at the 10-foot line extended, and coaches should not be coming in and engaging with the table or with us inside the substitution zone. And then, when you decide to engage a coach of your initiation, make sure you use the rulebook language. The more precise and direct you can be, the more it is going to help the situation and make it seem like you are in control, and are willing to process, but do so through the lens of the rulebook. And then do not engage in conversations or explanations with the assistant coach or players, on the bench. And if you are getting complaints and disrespectful behavior from assistant coaches or players on the bench, address that through the head coach. Okay, so we've reached the end of the presentation. I just wanted to revisit the 3 takeaways mindset and invite everyone that's stuck with this whole presentation to consider actually recording in writing any resonating thoughts or strategies that you want to think about more. Maybe you want to ask a colleague about, ask an assigner about. The next time you're able to attend a clinic, this would be a question you would want to consider, or something that you thought was a more informal technique that might be assistive to you. It's difficult because, whether we're working as an R2 or an R1 by ourselves, I would offer that either of those jobs are more difficult than working as an R1 with a partner. There's a lot of things to think about. Hopefully this presentation has provided you an opportunity to reflect and consider a few of those items as you continue to evolve your career. So I'll close the presentation with a few quotes. I'm just going to display each one and allow you to interpret it as you will. These are things that are part of my value system, and I appreciate the opportunity to share. I hope you found the presentation, albeit virtually, to be useful to you in regards to continuing to further your growth as an R2. Thank you again for your time.